Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world, around the country, around the city. Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Theresa J. And as you know, I talk about different issues related to education, economic related to education, legal issues related to education, books about education, specifically talking about the experience that took place during the desegregation process in this country and beyond. And it's coming from a lot of topics related to my book, Desegregation of Silk Stocking, the Desegregation of New York City Schools, a story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. So today's episode, I'm going to talk about the role of Black teachers in the New York City public schools during the early 1960s and beyond and before, just to give you a little history. Now, during the 1960s in New York City, most teachers were assigned to schools in neighborhoods where most Black teachers in particular were basically hired in neighborhoods where there was mostly Black and Puerto Rican students when they lived. So that's where most of those Black teachers that did exist were assigned. The teachers from other ethnic backgrounds who were assigned to the majority Black and public Puerto Rican schools were usually less experienced or had just met minimum qualifications. So that was why, many of those teachers who were not Black or Puerto Rican were basically new teachers or teachers who had just graduated from college. And one of the incentives that took place in New York City during this era was that I believe it's New York City. I don't know if it's something across the board, but I know it definitely was taking place in New York City during the 1960s. The New York City Board of Education allowed teachers to receive a relief, quote unquote, from their student loans if they taught in an underprivileged, quote unquote, school. And I think it was 3 years, they were able to waive if they worked at least 3 years in a supposedly underprivileged school, that it relieved them of paying off, helped them, to relieve them from paying off the loans. They had student loans and they were going to be teachers. Now, mind you, it might have been beyond 3 years, but I know it was probably at least 3 years. It could have been more. And I'll have to do more research on that, but I believe it definitely was 3 years because this was taking place in the 1960s. And so therefore, teachers who had just graduated, they would, want to get rid of some of their loans. They'd go teach in an underprivileged school. And of course, they tolerated for 3 years, and which was, I hate to say the word tolerated because that's probably what they did, because they knew they would get rid of the loans they had for schools. And then once they completed that the required years or the prior time for coming in, they came in, they would leave 3 years later. If that was a 3-year period, they would leave and then go to a district where they were more comfortable or maybe where they lived, which was not the underprivileged area. So that was an incentive that was taking place for many teachers and who were able to do that. And then, of course, by the 1970s, that all changed. Okay, interesting. That all changed in 1970. Wonder why, right? Well, it did. Panic. But I don't know if this was taking place in other parts of the northern United States or other parts of even outside of New York City, but I know it was taking place in New York City. And why I know that is because I know somebody who was applying for a teacher's position, and they had eliminated that option to teach in a specific school district or school and be able to be relieved from some of their student loan payments. That all changed in 1970, okay? And I wonder why that's the case, because during the 1970s, more people were graduating and were becoming teachers, or at least because they wanted to become a teacher, and that was probably an option that people had. And of course, the more Black people were getting out of college, especially in the North. Now, this is probably different in the South, because of course, majority of teachers who were teaching or had license to teach were basically in the South, not necessarily in the North. And because they were segregated schools more prominently identified in the South, that's where most teachers were teaching in predominantly Black schools, and all Black schools. It was probably not prominent, pretty much all Black schools, because of racial segregation, schools were racially segregated in the country, and specifically in the South. So in the North, it was basically where you lived. I can think housing patterns determine where you live, and the segregated housing patterns that took place. So you lived where you attended school. And of course, the schools that were closest to neighborhoods where mostly Black and Puerto Rican people lived, their children attended those schools in those neighborhoods. So let me just say this. Although desegregation efforts were taking place in predominantly white schools for students to go to those schools, that did not take place for teachers, which meant that teachers were not transferred or bused, quote unquote, to predominantly white schools. Only the Black and brown children were bused or sent to schools that were predominantly white. Okay, and that's interesting, and not much changed. So basically, there was no teachers going they weren't transferring teachers. The black brown teachers who existed in the 1960s and probably 50s remained when they were trying to do when they were trying to basically start some desegregation efforts in New York City schools. The focus was on students and not on teachers. Mind you, like I said before, there were still only a few. There weren't as many teachers, but the teachers that did exist who were Black or brown, they mostly taught in the predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods where students lived. So that's where they were placed. It wasn't, they were just assigned to those districts, point blank. So that was saying a lot about what was happening in New York City public schools. So that's why, in terms of PS6, there were no teachers of color, none, not one. And I was there from 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And to me, that was startling. That was a startling realization. Even though I only had my first Black teacher in the 3rd grade, it was, there were other Black teachers in the school. It was predominantly, I think there were predominantly, mostly, I mean, there were more than 1 or 2 or 3 teachers who were Black in the school when I attended my previous school in PS 157. But in PS 6, there were none. There were no Black and brown teachers at all for the entire time that I was there, from 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Now, I don't know how much different it is now, but the New York City Board of Education did not transfer teachers to, I talked about feeder and cinder schools in previous episodes, and I talked about that in my book. Well, PS6 was not listed in terms of one of the schools that would receive students. They selected the students they want. And I believe it's because PS6 was having an issue with enrollments, because many of the parents were moving out of the city and moving to the suburb. And so therefore their enrollments went down in PS6. So they needed to have children to replace the ones who were no longer coming in from the neighborhood. So I know my situation was part of that. It wasn't part of a quote unquote busing situation. I never traveled in a yellow school bus to go to any school. I only took the New York City transit buses to school, like many other students who lived within like more than 10 blocks away. You received a bus pass and you got in the bus and you went to your school. So that's interesting. But at the same time, like I said, teachers were not sent or assigned to PS6. And I'm not so sure they were assigned to any of the other schools that were actually some of the feeder schools that received students when they actually started the official yellow school bus busing situation. Now, I believe I have a friend who mentioned to me that she was part of taking a yellow school bus, even in not going to PS6, but another school, which was, I think, in a similar district as PS6. But I'm going to see if I can get her to speak on the podcast to talk about her experience. But I was unaware of that situation with her. So I know for a fact that I believe PS6 was not part of the quote yellow school bus until the time I was in my 5th grade. That's when yellow school buses transported students to PS6. And some students who were already zoned within PS6 end up going to other schools because that they rezoned the area. So if you lived outside that new zone, you had to go to another school other than PS6. But they never, ever made an effort to provide more Black teachers in these predominantly white schools. That was not part of the decision that was made when the New York City Public Schools decided to, quote unquote, desegregate schools. So you desegregate schools for students, but you don't desegregate schools for the teachers. Go figure, right? So I'm just saying that was something that people need to be aware of. So not much has changed in terms of teacher assignments to schools such as PS6. Maybe it's different in other schools, but not really. Okay. So now it brings back to the discussion of why Black and brown teachers. Why? That's the question mark. Why? There's a shortage, of course, we all know, a shortage of teachers around this country, and New York City is no different at this time. And so basically, as a whole, there's a shortage of teachers in New York City as well. So there are probably several reasons for this shortage of teachers. And we all should know about these circumstances. The current situation is taking place, and this is not all inclusive. There are other rationale or reasons as well. But one, I'll mention the three. Students are choosing other careers when they graduate. They go to college, they attend college. They're choosing other careers other than teaching or going to teaching. 2, low pay and less prestige. There's very low pay for being a teacher, and the prestige just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, pretty much. All right. And 3, violence and mass shootings and high-risk environments is now something that's basic, that's taking place in school. So it's discouraging other people who might have considered becoming a teacher to become a teacher. And of course, there are other reasons as well. But those are 3 specific ones that I believe are reasons for the current situation of shortage of teachers, specifically in New York City public schools. And let's go back. Students are choosing other careers. Well, there was a time when people could only choose 2 careers, especially Black people. They could only select 2 careers. That was either being a teacher in terms of profession or a minister. Now, there were other people, of course, who did go to medical school and so forth and so on, thanks to the HBCUs, where they attended college and were able to go to medical school or become, professor and so forth. But in essence, students really didn't have a choice at the time prior to the 1950s, give or take, to be able to go into other professions per se and be able to have a career, a life career. So there probably were many teachers who would have been excellent scientists or other kinds of professions, but lacking the opportunity as one reason is probably why they became teachers. Okay. The low pay and lack of prestige. That's pretty standard. Everyone says about education is important, but they don't pay teachers well enough to make it important. So why should someone pursue this as a career? Why? Why would somebody pursue this? So the pay is not equal to the time and effort that you put in to actually do your work, to be able, what you're doing, educating the future of America. So the pay is not equivalent to that. And also the lack of prestige that takes place in our society for teachers. So that discourages people as well. And of course, as we all know, the current situation of violence and mass shootings in schools is definitely something that's not welcoming when you're thinking about a career. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the case so long ago, but now it's something that's pretty standard, that people are mindful that this is a very high risk environment. So if you combine the lack of pay, the low pay salaries, the low prestige, and the fact that you can choose some other career and not have to deal with mass shootings and that level of violence, then you're not going to go into teaching. All right, so it gives you other options. Now let's go back to during the 1900s. Like I said before, most Black people had only 2 choices, pretty much. They want to be a professional, unless they were able to, I guess, to go to medical school, something like that. And so teaching and ministry were the 2 major professions that were, at that time, prestigious positions. Oh, she's a teacher, he's a teacher, or he's a minister, because there weren't female ministers. So that's another thing that has changed quite a bit. So, so if you're going to go to college and get an education, then if you were going to pursue that ministry or you pursue teaching. And so you would have a prestigious, um, respectful position as a profession. Okay. So that was the other reason. Okay. Now, we talk about people choosing other professions. I mentioned that earlier. And even though it was a segregated society at the time, not much has changed. There's still those issues that we talk about in terms of what would you want to do? What can you do? And they're still limiting. So and still the issue of discrimination is still taking place, even though the opportunity to actually pursue a specific career exists with the hassles and stresses that go along with it. Because believe me, I know I have a story to tell if that's the case. There's still an issue of discrimination that practice that take place in that workforce that still exists in our society today. So even that is still challenging, which also may preclude people from pursuing other professions because they'll pursue professions that they can, they're guaranteed certain things because there's no guarantee if you apply for, I guess, maybe actuary or something, and you get in a corporation, and you're not necessarily going to be able to go up the ladder or something. So you either drop out or you pursue something else, or what are you going to do? All right. So there are many things that are happening in our society that gives us something to think about in terms of what do you do next, and what do you do next, what do you do next. So being a teacher is not necessarily something that people are pursuing at this point, right? They're not pursuing it, and there's a reason behind that. So if you think about it, let me just give you a summary here. If it were not for my first Black teacher, Mrs. Shervington, I still know her name to this day, and the fact that she was, of course, teaching in a predominantly Black school in a predominantly Black neighborhood. Well, it was a Black neighborhood. Well, not necessarily predominantly, but it definitely was a predominantly Black neighborhood because we had some diverse people at that time still in the neighborhood. And if you watch my previous podcast, I showed where my original elementary school, PS 157, is located. And then I show you about PS 6, see where PS 6 is located. So basically, that was in PS 157, which had more Black teachers in it than the other teachers. And of course, they did have predominantly, there were other white teachers there, but many of them, I said before, were new teachers or teachers who were like maybe near the end of their career, and they were going to retire out, and they figured they didn't have to do as much work. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't say. I'm just speculating here. That's a possibility that they came to teach there. Maybe they really want to work with the community and work with this population. That I'm just giving it, the benefit of the doubt here, that they wanted to be there as opposed to being because they had to be there. Or maybe they wanted to work there because they wanted to get rid of their loans. Now, mind you, once they removed that loan forgiveness process as part of the New York City public schools, the teachers in the most difficult communities were people who, at that point, couldn't leave the system because they'd been in the system, they had been invested in the system so long, they want to stay there until they retired, or they would work there until they can get a position in another suburb of New York, and they would leave. So that's what would happen. They would get the experience, and then they would leave so they can get an opening in their district, someplace in the suburbs of New York City or the outskirts of New York City, or in Long Island, upstate New York. That would be an option for them. So they only stayed in the New York City public schools within New York City as limited time as possible. So that's a disadvantage. So my first Black teacher was, of course, third grade. And I believe that set a standard for me. I was unsure whether I would have had the courage and confidence to pursue what I decided to pursue in my life if it were not for that Black teacher. That's just my own personal experience. Now, it may not be the same for other students, but for me, that struck me to the point where it resonated throughout my entire educational career. And then I believe I only had after that third grade teacher, I only had, I believe, I think it was only two Black teachers in an academic subject. One was in in English in my junior high school. And of course, now it's called middle school, but back then it was junior high school, and that was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And then I had a Black teacher, which I'll never forget, as a math teacher in high school in 10th grade. Um, it's interesting. They were all females, okay? They were all females. I never had a Black male teacher ever in the classroom, which is not surprising. It wasn't surprising then, and it's not necessarily surprising now because for a variety of reasons, because if a Black male did pursue education, get a college degree, of course, not necessarily they were hired to work in the certain schools, or they chose other professions where they felt they didn't have to have a college degree. But those who chose to become teachers, they were few and far between. And then there were subjects that I probably didn't enroll in or didn't have to take, that probably why I didn't have a Black male teacher. So that says a lot about which fields that Black males pursued who did choose teaching. And we all know many of them are, phys ed teachers, and maybe became coaches of the teams in the schools, those kinds of things. So that's really where you may have seen them in the classrooms, or you may have seen them in, like, I can't recall, they had like, some tech courses, I think. I can't recall, like, whatever. I know there were a couple of Black teachers that were in my high school, for sure. I remember that. I have to tell you, I don't recall a single. Maybe I'm just. Maybe I'm not realizing this, but I don't recall having seen a single Black male teacher in my junior high school. I would have to check with some of my friends from junior high school who are still around and say, hey, were there any Black teachers there? Black male teachers? Because I know there's a few Black female, but I don't recall any Black male teachers that I know. I didn't have any. Okay. So that says to you how few there were then. All right. But I know for a fact, if it were not for my foundation of having that Black teacher in 3rd grade, I'm pretty sure that I would not have had the confidence that I had to move forward. And I just seeing her made a difference in my life, saying, I can do this. And she wanted the best for us. As I mentioned, when I taught in Cincinnati, a suburb of Cincinnati, as a 4th grade teacher, and I chose the 4th grade to teach because maybe that was symbiotic, I guess you call that. I'm thinking, I'm trying to take up for what I wish I had a 4th grade teacher when I went to PS6 who would have been a Black teacher. And I think that would have made a huge difference for me as well. But I believe the foundation, having my 3rd grade teacher being a Black female teacher on top of that, inspired me that I could do anything. All right. And so I feel that we need to have more teachers who represent the communities and the students who are attending the schools. There should be a diverse group of teachers in every public school, as much as possible, to give children the ability to aspire and give them encouragement to be able to do what they need to do, because they can do it. They just need some guidance and support, and just sometimes having that role model, just to look at that role model, and be able to say, I can do this. So it's unfortunate because I don't think much has changed now. And now, of course, there's a shortage of teachers, and less individuals applying to teaching careers for a variety of reasons I mentioned already. And there are probably other reasons that I don't know about that you can probably think of and just put in the comments. I just don't know what they are. But those are really 3 prominent ones. And it says a lot about what we do as a society. If we don't educate, then who's going to be the people who are going to take care of us when we get older, and so forth and so on, and feel, and then also keep up to date with what's happening in terms of what's needed to be able to have a livelihood and have a life and live and have a comfortable life in America. Okay, that's the key. What else are you going to do? So I think that we need to have educators, and we need to make sure we pay educators accordingly and give them the recognition that they well deserve. And there are people who are just there just to be there. Find something else to do, because we don't need anybody else to mess up a child's life. We just don't need that. And I mean, I'm saying this just from my own personal and professional experience and all my own research, um, how it's so important to have uh, well educated and qualified teachers starting from day one. The moment a child hits the classroom, they should have the ability to have the best opportunity to have the best uh, teacher they can get, because the foundation at that stage builds upon everything else. Now, I still consider the third grade early childhood. Some people don't, but I do. But I'm just saying, that was my first encounter with a Black teacher. And it says a lot about our society. And it says a lot about New York City. So hopefully we can turn things around. No, not going to turn. We just start anew. I think we just start anew. Forget about turning. We don't need to turn things around, because if you turn things around, it's going to come back to the same thing again. No, let's do a new deal here. Let's try something different. Let's try another. Let's start again from someplace else. Let's take what we know from the past and learn from that and build upon that for the future. That's what I want to say about that particular topic of the role of Black teachers, not just in New York City, but in the United States of America, and in the North in particular, okay? And the North and the Midwest in particular. So at this point, I think that's about all I want to talk about in terms of the Black teachers, and some little history and some of my ideas of what we can do better. We need to do better, not just stay the same, but just to do better. I hope that we can do that, and I believe we can if we just take the right steps. Because there's plenty of people out there, I believe, who believe in the philosophy of making sure of excellence for every child, no matter where they are around the country. All right. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family, and not so friends and family as well. So until next time, enjoy wherever you are around the country, around the world. And we'll just see you at the next episode of Silk Stocking Sisters. Have a great day. Bye now.